Hi, my name is Jamie. Thank you for the great introduction. Thank you for Tsleil-Waututh Nation for inviting me to speak today. I'm very honored to be here. There are definitely some friends in the room. I just wanted a quick show of hands. How many people know about this project? Okay. For some of you, this might be a bit of a review. For others, hopefully it will be a great introduction. Chief Thomas talked earlier about the need for really equitably thinking about Indigenous knowledge and how it can inform a lot of the work that's being talked about in earlier panels. And I'd like to hope that this particular project will give you an idea of potentially how that could be done, at least from the point of view of Swinomish, which is the tribe that I work with. Just for folks who don't know where Swinomish is, Swinomish Reservation is about 2 hours south of here, an hour and a half north of Seattle. We're the gateway island to the San Juan Islands. The reservation has 7,000 acres of uplands and is 90% ringed by water. So it's a low-lying reservation. We're on the mouth of the Skagit River, where all 6 species of salmonids are, and we were early to think about climate change impacts. So in 2007, the Swinomish Senate signed a proclamation that climate change exists, it's real, and we're already feeling the impacts, and we need to address it. Very proactive. 2009, we did an impact assessment, and 2010, an adaptation plan. They're freely available on the Swinomish website. The reason why I bring this up is because there's a lot of background work in here, including issues about health, which I'm going to talk about today, but they're very limited to the way that other municipalities and regions think about climate change and impacts, and not really in the way that the tribe wanted to think about impacts to community members. So I put this up here not because I expect anyone to read it, but because it gives you a sense of the types of scales and the way that we scaled data. So you can have a couple of different types of scales. You can have numeric scales. You can have proxy scales. What we use are constructed scales. So thinking about everything from impacts to infrastructure, to ecosystems, to health, you can use constructed scales and actually think about how to compare them across seemingly non-commensurate values. I bring this up because this is really the way that we started thinking about the work that I'm going to present to you. So just kind of think about that at the moment. This slide is here because it's a series to try and explain the background of why we're doing this in pictures. So what you see is a patient and a doctor talking about environmental health, and the doctor saying environmental health and climate change is things like increases in vector-borne diseases, and increases in heat-related diseases, and increases in drownings from rising sea levels. And the patient's thinking, I want to talk about my traditional foods because this is a really strong connection to me, and this is the connection that I have to my land. And so you see an image specifically for Swinomish of clam, salmon, crab, and elk. But I think when talking to a lot of folks, Indigenous or not, when you talk about climate change, and there's been research about this, talking about health is the way to really activate folks' interest in thinking about and doing something about climate change. There's a lot of studies that look at, you can talk to them about the environment, you can talk to them about increases in sea level rise or temperature, but people don't actually really connect because they have so many other things to think about in the day unless you start talking about health. And then the next question is, what does health mean? Well, for a lot of folks in this room, health may have to do with physiological factors. In the United States, the CDC uses the BRACE framework, which is building resilience against climate impacts, and it's the way that they look at climate change. So they look at the projected models, they think about what the impacts of the disease burden would be, and this is completely physiological, and then they use this to determine their risks and their planning, and then they move forward in a cyclical manner. This slide is the way that Swinomish thinks about health. So this is a very different way of thinking about health. You will not see any physiological implications here. They are important, but there's other aspects of health that are often left out of the equation, whether we're talking about climate change or any other types of contexts like contamination or development. Each community, each Indigenous nation is unique. So everybody has their own set of Indigenous health indicators, but there are definitely themes that run through all of them. So at Swinomish, we have 6. These are all developed from over 100 interviews that Swinomish Elder Larry Campbell and I did together, as well as a lot of background source material. And What's important about this is that when you're thinking about climate change, these are some of the impacts that you need to think about. How is climate change going to impact community connection? How is it going to impact self-determination and sovereignty? These are some of the terms that you don't normally hear about when people talk about climate change impacts. And this is also a way that I strongly recommend all of you to get out of your little disciplines and think about how to integrate and how to be transdisciplinary. Because you may be an ecologist, but that doesn't mean that your work isn't integrally tied to something that, for instance, a cultural elder is doing. So I think it's really important to think very broadly and how these are connected and thinking about the sociocultural system together, but also to know that Indigenous knowledge is not just a way of knowing, but a way of doing. It's a different knowledge, and you can't simply take little pieces of it and plop it into the knowledge that you're familiar with and assume that that will be sufficient. So it's really about coming to the table and really trying to create an equitable playing field to bring this knowledge forward, and that's really what we're hoping that the Indigenous indicators are able to do. We rewrote BRACE, and we said that we want to think about BRACE and in terms of health from the tribal point of view, from Swinomish point of view, and in that way we're going to think about it on the basis and the platform of First Foods, because from your local ecosystems and your local nature comes culture, comes health. And that's the way that the Swinomish people think about health. And so that connection is there, and so if you want to think about climate change and impacts, that's the best way to do it. Here's another visual description of how we did it. So we wanted to look at habitat structure and function change for 3 different important first foods, salmon, crabs, and clams, in 6 different areas on the Swinomish Reservation. There's several different potential climate change related impacts there. We focused on storm surge and sea level rise. And then we used the Indigenous health indicators as a way to assess what those impacts would be in the community. Why? I mentioned in 2007, Swinomish signed a proclamation saying that climate change was real and we are already seeing the effects. This is one picture. This is a storm in early 2016. You can see it's come up over the embankment, over the roads, and is flooding homes. This used to be called the 100-year flood, and now it's pretty much the every other year flood at Swinomish. So we're definitely seeing the impacts now. We want to know what is that going to do to the really important clam digging beaches? What is it going to do to the outgoing juvenile salmon habitat? What is it going to do to the crab rearing habitat? So we picked 6 different areas at Swinomish. We picked them for various reasons, whether it's current habitat, historic habitat, the elevation, the sediment grain size, various reasons. And what we did was we worked with the Swinomish scientists in the fisheries department and asked them to run projections for 2050 with sea level rise and storm surge and how the habitats of those particular 3 species would change. Then we created pictures. So this is one particular area. This is Lone Tree Point, and we created pictures of what those potential projected impacts would be. And this is what we took to the community. So we said of the 3 species that we looked at a very important area at Swinomish, we're going to see significant impacts to salmon. What you see right there is one of the first estuarine areas that outgoing juvenile salmon can hide. When they come out of the Skagit River, that will be completely wiped out by 2050, according to the projections. Both the clam and the crab habitat are going to see medium-high impacts as well, in terms of a lot of the beach area being washed away, so there won't be any areas for any of the clams, and as well as the eelgrass beds where the crabs normally go will also be inundated, and there isn't much of a way for that to naturally accrue up the beach line. But these particular images are images that Swinomish community members are very familiar with, and they've been going to these areas or lived in these areas since time immemorial. So to show them these areas and to show them what particular changes will be to first foods that are so integrally important to community health has a significant impact. So we asked a series of questions. We showed these images to almost 100 people on the reservation, and then we asked, of the 6 different areas, knowing that they're all important, but knowing that we have limited time and resources, which ones do you want us to focus on first? And so these were the answers that we got. I'm showing this to you simply because I'm trying to demonstrate that there are ways to get this information without having to actually do very detailed scenarios and thinking about working with community. This is the one I really want to focus on, though. So we asked the same question about each of the different Indigenous health indicators, and we said, knowing what you know now about what the projected impacts are to salmon, crabs, and clams by 2050, and knowing that all the Indigenous health indicators at Swinomish are important. Of the 6, with limited time and resources, which ones do you want us to focus on first? And this data really surprises me. I thought hands down everyone was going to say natural resources security. They didn't. It came in number 2. Education came in number 1. Everybody said over and over again with very high correlation, education is so important. We need to continue our knowledge and we need to pass it on to our youth. And that's really what we want you to focus your limited time and resources on. And so that's what we've been doing. This project is just wrapped up, and with it we've also started the 13 Moons. 13 Moons is a traditional harvest calendar for many Coast Salish communities, not just Swinomish. The particular wheel here is in Lutschutseed and English and is specific to Swinomish. But the point is that this is the type of education that the community wants to continue, not just with youth, but people of all ages, to really ensure that that connection exists. And as Swinomish says, they've been here since time immemorial, and they'll be here for time immemorial. And things change. Nothing is stagnant. Culture isn't stagnant. And that's why culture continues to exist, because it adapts. So knowing that climate change is coming and being educated about it and knowing what the impacts will be to first food is a great way to just continue that adaptation process. Because unlike many people, Swinomish can't change the lines of their reservation. They will always be there. They're not going to up and move because something has been inundated. So it has to do a lot with change. And there's been a lot of really forward thinking among the tribes in Washington state, for instance, signing memorandums of understanding as first foods begin to migrate to new and different areas, being able to harvest in those new areas if they're in other tribal areas, and also sharing the knowledge within the tribes. So there's a lot of really innovative work going on. And I know a lot of the Indigenous folks in this room are already very well familiar with it. For the folks that aren't familiar with working with Indigenous communities, I just want to say, understand that it is not your knowledge, and go in with the utmost respect if you want to work with Indigenous communities in helping this process forward. Because particularly in Washington state, and with the treaties, the tribes are very strong, and they're really the ones that are pushing the climate change issues right now. We all know what's going on in the federal government, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of action going on at the local and regional level. And so working with the tribes in Washington is the best way to continue the conversation forward. This is just an example of Swinomish kids in lab coats doing paralytic shellfish poisoning tests as they're learning about their own first foods. Something else that we're doing is we're going to build the first clam garden in the lower 48. Does everybody know what clam gardens are? Awesome. So as you probably all well know, there are several off the coast of Vancouver Island and in the islands off BC. There is a lot of data about remnants of clam gardens south of the border. But there aren't any functioning clam gardens currently. So we are working on a project to site and develop the first clam garden for Swinomish. We're not looking at ecological data solely, we're also looking at sociocultural data as well. Where are the areas that tribal members want to go? Why? Why are some of these areas off limits, even though they're really important, potentially ecologically, to build clam gardens? And clam gardens, there is some data that demonstrates that clam gardens may be very useful in climate change issues like sea level rise and storm surge. They may be able to attenuate waves as you build these terraces. Also, a lot of the communities outside of the clam gardens, like increased eelgrass, may also help. So there's a lot of really interesting data out there, and another way to move forward in terms of adaptation, bringing back an Indigenous technology that's been around for millennia. The last thing that we're doing at Swinomish is really trying to work with other Indigenous communities who are interested in using the Indigenous health indicators and developing their own for their own projects, climate change or otherwise. And so we're developing free online learning modules that any tribal staff can use in North America, and providing online guidance and also personal guidance if they want us to come out. So mostly when working with Indigenous communities, there's a lot of support, community to community, to really help and bolster each other up and move forward. And that is, I think, another way to really think about resiliency in the face of climate change. Am I less than 15 minutes? Hopefully? Score. Okay. This is a picture of Swinomish Tribal Chairman Brian Clattersby beach seining. If you're not familiar, beach seining is something that many Indigenous communities do, and is also part of the process that is going to be inundated quickly. This is at Lone Tree Point. In fact, 2 summers ago, all the beach sitting equipment was out on the beach, and we had a really freak high tide. There was no storms. It was just a king tide in the middle of the night. It was not predicted at all, and thousands of dollars of beach sitting equipment were washed away. And no one had ever heard of that happening in the history of the tribe on an August night. So this is an image of a very important practice that it's more than just physiological health and consumption of calories, right? This is a cultural keystone species as well as a keystone species. And so ensuring that the tribe has continued access to salmon is part of the climate change plan as well. So to Seed for listening, and my colleague Larry Campbell, also who couldn't be here today, says thank you for listening to the work that we do, and if you have any questions, please contact me.